This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, my guest is Dr. Maxwell Greenberg. Maxwell Greenberg is Assistant Professor of Judaic Studies in the Department of Cultural Studies at Goucher College and is an interdisciplinary scholar and educator who researches and teaches about race, religion, gender, and place. He earned his PhD in Chicana and Central American Studies from UCLA in 2021 before serving as the Friedman Postdoctoral Fellow in Jewish Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He works at the intersection of Jewish, religious, and Indigenous studies and is particularly interested in how Judaism and Jewish memory function as unstable tools of statecraft in the U.S. On this episode, we discuss the PhD process, postdoctoral fellowships, and a research project involving Jewish pioneer cemeteries in the American Southwest that covers a broad range of academic interests. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Maxwell Greenberg. Dr. Maxwell Greenberg, welcome to Classical Ideas Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if you can start off a little bit by introducing yourself just a bit to the audience so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. I am an interdisciplinary scholar with a focus on race, religion, and the power of place. I'm currently an assistant professor of Jewish and American Studies at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland.
I've never been to Baltimore, and I've actually been thinking about doing that lately, going down to Baltimore and checking that out. How have you enjoyed your time there? Because I know that you're a relatively recent transplant to the city.
I am. Well, nothing but good things to say about Baltimore, so you should definitely try to make that trip. I relocated here in July of this past summer, 2023. I moved from St. Louis, Missouri, where I was a postdoc in Jewish Studies at Washington University, and was fortunate enough to make a connection with Goucher College. They were hiring a tenure track position for kind of a really hybrid position in Jewish Studies. That it was that one job application where I said, I do know that I can do this job, because they were really looking for someone who could teach Jewish Studies in a way that was really relevant and interesting for people of any kind of ethno-religious or racial background, and kind of a bringing Jewish Studies into the disciplines of American Studies and religion and justice, as they call it at Goucher. So it was kind of like a tailor-made position given my disciplinary training, which I'm excited to talk to you a little bit more about, but really kind of breaks the mold of what a traditional Jewish Studies scholar is, which is, I think, very emblematic of a lot of liberal arts schools, and especially Goucher. Lots of freedom to approach our interests in unique ways. I didn't answer your question about Baltimore, though. I have been doing other things besides work. I live in this neighborhood actually called Old Goucher. And that was a total coincidence. It's actually the site of where Goucher College used to be up until the 1950s, I believe. It was originally a school. It was called the Baltimore College for Women. And the original Methodist church that was at the center of the college is just one block away, and I can actually see it out my window. And several, like the old president's house. The old presidential house is actually now a pretty fancy gin bar, and it's up the street from me. So it's this neighborhood that kind of has the ghosts and the history of the college I now work at, which is up in Baltimore County, where it moved after the 1950s. So that was just kind of a happy coincidence with where we landed when I relocated to Baltimore.
I want to know a little bit about your educational journey too, because I'm looking at the work that you've done, and I know that you graduated with a degree from studying Chicana and Central American studies, but then also did your postdoctoral fellowship in Jewish studies at WashU. And I'm wondering if you can kind of tie those two things together for me, to kind of talk to me about your thinking and your path of how those fed into each other.
It started with, if it's all right with you, just kind of going back to where I grew up.
Yeah.
Which is, I grew up in the Northern Bay Area in California, in Marin County. And, the county as a whole is predominantly really white, very affluent, and primarily Christian. But I actually really didn't know how Christian it was, because I was at a Jewish day school from kindergarten through ninth, just through eighth grade. So the first 9 years of my schooling. So my whole kind of social academic life was extremely Jewish. I, didn't really have a good sense of kind of who my other neighbors were. So I had this kind of very particular experience growing up in Marin. My school was kind of like many Jewish day schools, pretty, Zionist orientation to education, which meant that when we were learning languages, we learned Hebrew. Kind of our historical timeline of when and where Jews lived kind of moved from the biblical period right up to the 19th century, and kind of the Pale of Settlement, Eastern European, Fiddler on the Roof era of Jewish history, and then moved into the 20th century in Europe and Nazi Germany in World War II. The history kind of ends with the Israeli state, 1948, and then Jews living in the United States. So it was kind of this very, narrow and partial timeline of Jewish history, and kind of those were the tools I had to understand what it meant to be Jewish where I was growing up, and both like linguistically and the historical timeline didn't quite neatly match the reality that I was living. And I went to a public high school after this Jewish day school, and I took my first Spanish language class, and that was really transformative because I think it was the first time I understood why anyone learns a language, which is to use it and talk to people, and really taking something you learn in a classroom and having it impact your life and how you move through the world. And I went to undergrad at Kenyon College, and I was a Spanish major. I ended up focusing in actually Chicano studies within that Spanish language major, because of a lot of the literature, especially this one really pivotal book written by Gloria Ansaldúa called Borderlands La Frontera.
Great book.
Really, it's part of the reason I ended up in Chicano studies at UCLA. You're really thinking about the role that the U.S.-Mexico border is both a place and an idea, how that kind of shapes our multiple identities and the ways that we are separated from each other and ourselves, and kind of the way that the legacies of colonialism live in our bodies. And one of the reparative methods that Ansaldúa uses is through language, and through really centering Spanglish as kind of an innate language of border spaces, and particularly the U.S.-Mexico border. There was something about reading Spanglish. It reminded me of kind of where I grew up, and I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I was near fluent at the time, and kind of that hybridity between English and Spanish just felt like home to me. So that was kind of really locked. This field of Chicano studies, and especially Ansaldúa's work, which it really kind of put me on the path to thinking about how I could continue my studies in this field, really knowing very little about it until I ended up in this graduate program at UCLA. But I think it planted a lot of seeds for me to think about how how the US-Mexico border as both a space and an idea has also shaped Jewish identity along kind of gendered, sexual, racial, religious lines. So I'll say, yeah, that book was really pivotal getting me to UCLA. And then, it took me at UCLA, like any graduate student, it took me a little while to realize that the gap in the scholarship is a good thing for us to step into. I was teaching courses at UCLA as a TA about, colonial Mexico, or, the Spanish colonial project in what we call contemporary Mexico. And there was never any mention about kind of the religious diversity of European settlement. There was never mention of the Inquisition. And, that was kind of one of the foundational institutions in colonial Mexico. And when I started realizing that there's actually this really long history of religious diversity, all the way back to the colonial period, I guess I want to shout out someone's book who helped me lean in to my what ended up being my dissertation project, which was Libby Garland's text, After They Closed the Gates: A History of Illegal Jewish Immigration to the U.S., 1921 to 1965. Mm-hmm. And Garland's work is looking at the way that these national quota laws that the United States passed in 1921 after World War I kind of would overtly target Eastern and Southern European migrants, really explicitly in the language, but then the experience of these immigration restrictions on the ground were radically different. And she's helping her readers make sense of how this term illegal immigrant becomes synonymous with Mexican origin migrants by the mid 20th century, despite the fact that US quota laws were overtly targeting many European origin migrants. And so this was really the first book that kind of was historical and included a Jewish history to help me think about immigration and illegality and race making, and specifically how those dynamics collide at the US-Mexico border. So that was the book I would say that really gave me permission to take seriously the base of the US-Mexico border and the American West as kind of a baseline or a regional baseline for thinking about Jewish history in a different way, and that the Jewish histories that have happened in those places have something new to teach us about how race and religion function in the United States and transnationally. So that book kind of set me on my path to my dissertation work. And then the position at WashU, they were specifically looking for someone who teaches Jewish studies in a U.S. context, and who thinks about race, religion, and social movements, gender and sexuality. And within Jewish studies, I would say the United States is really kind of a marginalized field, and then the American West is even more kind of niche. So they were, excited to bring someone in who was kind of an Americanist, but was able to teach kind of American studies through the lens of Jewish history.
How did you like being at WashU? I was born and raised in St. Louis, so I am curious about how your experience was living there.
St. Louis was a wonderful spot. I was lucky enough to live right near campus in some of their grad housing. So it was a delight to walk to work. I think as soon as I got to St. Louis, I read this really powerful text called The Broken Heart of America. St. Louis, to me, it's the biggest national monument there is, of course, the arch, the Gateway Arch. I think it was a pretty poetic space for me to go to after spending time in Los Angeles. I spent a year and a half about in Tucson, Arizona, finishing up my dissertation. We don't think about the Southwest as connected to the Midwest or to St. Louis in any way, but in fact, the West, I would say, starts in St. Louis in a lot of ways. The idea and the project and process of the frontier starts in St. Louis with Lewis and Clark. And we have this, gargantuan monument to westward expansion right in the heart of the city. Walter Johnson's book kind of helped me think about how the histories of settler colonialism and plantation capitalism really collide in this powerful way in St. Louis that he traces all the way up to the summer of 2014 and the murder of Michael Brown and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. He's saying, it's not a coincidence that our current movement for abolition starts in St. Louis, because it has this long history of both tremendous repression and also tremendous resistance and liberation struggle. So it was both, it felt really connected to kind of places I had lived and and what I had been studying, and also was just a fantastic spot to think about, the history and reality of race making in the United States. WashU was beautiful, and they had, great resources for me to get out a few more papers and then of course go on the job market again.
I want to chat about some of your work, and so many of the details that you've given about your academic path tie so clearly into some of the work of yours that I've been reading lately about the American Southwest, about the border, about Jewish communities and people throughout American history in the Southwest in ways that, I wasn't really expecting to read about. So it's really cool to see your work. And I want to chat a little bit about Jewish pioneer cemeteries specifically. And so I want to start with the kind of a context question with some demographics a little bit. Like, what do listeners out there need to know about Jewish settlers throughout the American Southwest in the 18th and 19th centuries that they might not know?
I referenced briefly, there's Jewish histories of Jewish settlement in what we call the contemporary American Southwest, dating all the way back to the Spanish colonial period. So we can think, broadly between the 16th and early 19th century up till 1821, there are people with Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, Afro-diasporic, indigenous religious identities who have settled and lived in and around the contemporary American Southwest and northern Mexico, all the way back to the beginning of the Spanish colonial period. If we're thinking about the modern American Southwest with a contemporary U.S.-Mexico border, so that would be post 1848, after the Mexican-American War, we want to think about European Jewish settlement, migration and settlement to this region kind of in two primary ways. The first, I would say, there's a migratory wave of primarily German origin Jewish immigrants beginning in the 1820s. This population was overwhelmingly less religious, more wealthy. They might have been part of the Reform Jewish movement. They had undergone a period called Jewish emancipation that occurred in Central Europe in the 18th century. I'm sure some of them would be considered refugees in a sense, but these were primarily people who had the means to migrate without the kind of urgency and precarity that we see in the latter migratory wave. And that would be the Jewish, Eastern European Jewish population that kind of begins migrating out to the American West, kind of post 1850s. This is a less wealthy, more religious kind of class of political and religious refugees who are largely fleeing religious repression in this particular part of the Russian Empire known as the Pale of Settlement, where for centuries Jews were relegated to live and work. And so those were this German origin and Eastern European Jewish migratory waves kind of beginning in the 1820s and then the second wave in the 1850s. Those are the kind of the primary populations I would want to highlight. And then, of course, thinking about, what is the draw to this region? I would put three categories. I would say land, and the idea of free, and I put that in big scare quotes, free land that the U.S. promised Euro-American settlers who wanted to participate in westward expansion, the socioeconomic mobility that was promised. There was jobs and money, and then this promise of religious freedom, of course, and that's really throughout so much of the early work on Jews in the American West, kind of the early scholarship, is you'll see a really common narrative that there was less anti-Semitism in the American West than there was in the eastern cities of the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. Ostensibly Jews were more white or more assimilated into whiteness in the 19th century in the American West. And I think people make that point for several reasons, in part because it's a much less densely populated area for Jews. So you wouldn't see like a Lower East Side Jewish shtetl neighborhood out in the American West in the 19th century. In fact, it's known that it was a struggle to even have a minyan, or the minimum required number of Jews to hold services. Like that was a common challenge that at least Jewish men who settled out in the West might encounter. And then, of course, if we want to think about race as a relational process that happens in certain contexts, Jews' kind of closer proximity to whiteness out in the American West during this time is impacted by kind of a greater racial diversity that exists in the region. So Jewish settlers have neighbors who are, from different indigenous tribes, Black Americans, Mexican origin people, an Asian origin, and primarily Chinese population in and around mining towns, military bases that really kind of become the central nodes of settlement for many Jewish immigrants at the time, for economic reasons. Land, money, economic mobility, and religious freedom are kind of the primary drivers of settlement. And one example that maybe I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of, Levi Strauss. So Levi Strauss is kind of a primary example of at least the German Jewish population who came to the American West at a particular time. He's closely associated with the gold rush. Levi jeans were kind of the official garment for miners. That's a great example of how Jewish socioeconomic mobility is so closely tied up with, settler colonial violence and native dispossession and removal, and then, of course, these extractive mining economies that go along with that. And so that business kind of was really wound up with at least the gold mining industry, for example, in California. And we see, when we kind of talk a little bit more about the Jewish pioneer cemeteries that I focus on in Arizona, copper mining was the primary industry that many Jewish settlers were attached to.
Let's dive into those cemeteries. I want to know a little bit, first of all, why you're interested in cemeteries, but also how many Jewish pioneer cemeteries exist that people now can, see for themselves.
Cemeteries remind me of like why it was a real accident. I went to Tucson for one of my first kind of impromptu trips and was told by people in town that I needed to go see this 100-year-old, quote unquote, lost or hidden or destroyed Jewish cemetery that was right next to the border wall in this border town called Douglas, that was just right across from Sonora. I think cemetery, it was a really spontaneous drive, and I ended up encountering multiple cemeteries on that drive down. I'm thinking about how I love horror, the genre, and I think it's such a powerful medium and tool to understand grief and mourning and kind of the violence that can spill out when our grief and trauma are unattended to. And also just thinking about the land as something that holds a multiplicity of stories and histories, and of course, so much trauma. But then as those spaces as places that we can go back to to connect with ancestries, to do that kind of grief and mourning processes in a particular place, tying that up with kind of the ritual and the pilgrimage involved with that. So, that's just, I think, during my research, I'm trying to understand why I'm so interested in cemeteries, but I think just as thinking about what histories the land can teach us, they're just such a concentrated space of multiple communities' histories that like layer on top of each other and are existing in one site. So it's just kind of an amazing, baseline to pull out different group histories that often are kind of in competition or contradictory to one another.
When we were talking like off air earlier, something that I know that I would be the exact same, right? So whenever I was reading this article, I was like resonating with it big time because, for example, if people come and ever visit me in Buffalo, I tend to take people on what I jokingly refer to as the Buffalo Tour of Death, where I take them to the graves of Rick James and Millard Fillmore, and I take them to the spot where President William McKinley was shot. And I just have this like little list of places that really stand out to me for reasons that I don't really fully understand.
Mm-hmm.
But so whenever I was reading about your interest in these pioneer cemeteries, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I would be doing if I was in your shoes as well, I think.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, and it's just, when we want to, we talk a lot about, whose histories matter, whose histories are visible in public space. We think about that so much attached to our, current struggle around memorialization and commemorative landscapes and monuments in this country. And, cemeteries are this incredible, especially when they've been preserved or restored the way that several of these Jewish pioneer cemeteries have been. It's such an amazing case study about, how landscape, how preservation methods are telling us to interpret certain groups' histories and whose histories matter, whose grief matters, whose ancestors lay claim to the land, in a way that I think we're inherently told to take really seriously and to believe. The Jewish Pioneer Cemetery, I came in contact with this term Jewish pioneer just by living in multiple states in the American West and going to any kind of cultural Jewish space. I'm including museums, documentary films, monuments, plaques, anything that kind of talks about Jewish history that dates back to the 19th century and it's in the American West. You will see this language of Jewish pioneer. You asked this great question around, how many cemetery sites are there. What I know is that in California, and I've never been to these places, but there is a whole preservation initiative around Jewish pioneer cemeteries in California, primarily in what they call Gold Rush country. And I believe there's about seven protected cemeteries in Northern California. And then in Southern Arizona, which is where I focus, there are 3 cemeteries that I know of that kind of date back to late 19th, early 20th century. One of which is in Tombstone, Arizona, that I'd love to chat about, and the other of which is in Douglas, Arizona, and that's called the Bisbee Douglas Jewish Cemetery. And that is potentially the oldest Jewish burial site in the state of Arizona. Dating back to, I think, 1912 was when the first internment happened.
When I was reading about your descriptions of these sites, like Tombstone versus Bisbee Douglas, they seemed like touristy versus not touristy. And I'm wondering if you can like tell me a little bit about some of these differences that you see like in the range of touristy versus not touristy as far as these spots go.
So, Tombstone was, they're both towns that were settled and incorporated into the Arizona territory because of mining. And Tombstone had a really short-lived silver mine boom that brought in a bunch of settlers, Euro-American settlers in the 1880s. Douglas was closely connected to a town north of it called Bisbee. And they were all these towns were connected by the railroad. It was actually a cross-border binational railroad route into Sonora. And that was all due to the copper mining industry. And Bisbee was the hardcore mining town, and Douglas was the smelter town. So that's where the copper got processed. And I think the copper boom just had a much longer duration. And so Tombstone faced this challenge, like many mining towns in the Southwest have, which is they've extracted all the minerals they can from the land. Primary economic driver of the town is no longer viable. And so the town in the 1920s kind of started to make a decision, what is the primary economy of this town going to be? And they closely aligned themselves with actually the film industry in Hollywood and became basically a set for dozens of Western films. And I believe probably in the 1950s, it really started to kind of open up from just a film set to an actual tourist destination, with this kind of trope around, if you want to, visit, it's, an equivalent to a Wild Wild West Disneyland. If you want to come and kind of experience the quote unquote Old West of the 1880s, by which they mean, it's really a celebration of the history of vigilantism in the Southwest. You can go see a gunfight reenactment. You can go into kind of a historically preserved saloon. And then the way that this Tombstone Cemetery fits in is there's a grave site called the Boot Hill Tombstone's Boot Hill Graveyard. And it's, the lore is that the baddest, most violent cowboys and their victims are all, buried in this Boot Hill Cemetery. But the reason I stopped at that cemetery originally was because the welcome sign says Boot Hill Graveyard and Jewish Cemetery and Memorial in like smaller letters on the sign. And so it was just this immediate disillusionment and surprise about what a Jewish memorial or Jewish cemetery was doing in this town that was primarily, like I said, kind of like a Western set, old Wild Wild West Disneyland that, really overt, both performs the history of vigilantism in the Southwest, but also is currently, a real destination for militia members, kind of border patrol, otherwise members of the police force. And, if you ask anyone in Tombstone, which I have, who actually lives there, why did they end up relocating here? Overwhelmingly, people say that this is a state that protects my Second Amendment rights and I can bring my guns around with me wherever I want. And that's Tombstone felt like home to them. So I can't emphasize enough the gun culture there is really intense. And then, we look at Douglas. The copper industry kind of had exhausted itself by the mid 20th century. And, Douglas is a pretty, economically depressed border town. I am actually unsure of what the primary economic drivers are there now, but it's right next to the border wall. So while Tombstone is maybe kind of performing this kind of more romanticized history of vigilantism, when you're near the border wall and you kind of see the massive infrastructure of surveillance and militarization in that region, it's kind of like the reality and the kind of natural evolution to the history that Tombstone is telling, just 50 miles up the road. So it's they both have a really kind of intense surveillance military culture, but in really different ways and packaged very differently.
Interesting. Okay. When you go to these spaces from the article, it sounds like there are people that are very excited to talk to you, to show you the off the beaten path sites. I'm wondering kind of what the local towns are doing to remember these spaces, how they're supporting your work, and any stories about meeting people along the way that have kind of pointed you in the right direction.
Oh, for sure. So when I went to the Bisbee Douglas Cemetery for the first time, it was one of those special moments where Google Maps actually didn't even know where the cemetery was. So I I had to go talk to real human beings in the town when I drove in. And I made a stop at the Douglas Historical Society. Luck had it, they were open that day. They're open one day a week. And I went in and, I talked to the first person I saw and said, look, I studied Jewish history in the border region. I heard about this cemetery. Can you tell me anything? And they immediately pointed me to one of their exhibition rooms. It's a really small space, but one of the entirety of one of their exhibition rooms was dedicated to this quote unquote Jewish pioneer history of Douglas. So even though there hadn't been Jewish life in Douglas for formal organized Jewish life in Douglas for almost 100 years, and there was never more than maybe 60 Jewish families in Douglas, the Historical Society itself really foregrounds the fact that there was a Jewish community there at all, which I found really interesting and had questions about. And those folks were kind enough to kind of point me in the general direction of where the cemetery was. And, you really just need to follow the border wall. It was a little east of downtown Douglas, because, traditionally Jewish cemeteries need to be built in the outskirts of town. So, it very much was kind of on the outskirts of the town center. When I got there, I took a walk around the cemetery, and I know you asked kind of what their state of repair or preservation was. And because, I've been visiting the cemetery since 2018, and it's actually undergone extensive restoration over that time. But when I first was there, it was definitely weeds overgrown, graffiti on certain headstones, nothing explicit, just general spray paint, and a pretty old looking fence. And then this historical plaque marker that had been put there in 1993. I got a good sense of it. Felt lonely. It felt abandoned, and it did feel forgotten about. Felt really desolate. And I think, being in the cemetery space and knowing that, there are ghosts there, I think it heightened that feeling of loneliness and isolation. And then, the border wall is about, 50 to 100 yards south of the cemetery. So I walked up to the border wall after I was done looking around, and was, within 30 seconds approached by Border Patrol in a car. We had a pretty interesting interaction that I've been trying to make sense of since. I had experience as both a pedestrian and a commuter in a vehicle going across U.S. port of entries between Tijuana and San Diego. So, it was not surprising to me that Border Patrol can immediately spot you when you're standing at any given part of the border wall. There's surveillance everywhere. His vehicle approached me, and I had been instructed by people who have lived and worked and commuted in border spaces, kind of what the best practices are when Border Patrol is approaching you. And part of the kind of strategy of marking yourself as non-threatening was to really highlight, anything about your family or religion. I was explicitly told, say if you're visiting somewhere for religious purposes, tell them that. So I immediately, when I talked to the Border Patrol agent, I immediately told him that, I'm Jewish American. This is a Jewish cemetery. I'm visiting this Jewish cemetery. And, he seemed really excited about that. And he knew about the cemetery, and then said, what really stuck with me about that interaction was he told me pretty explicitly, well, that I didn't look illegal. He needed to come kind of check out the situation anyway, because I had showed up on their camera. That was it was a really hard thing to hear. Not super surprising. I'm a white person, I'm trans, but I, kind of walk through the world passing as a man. And, it was, kind of all the trappings of what, our surveillance state has deemed an illegal or not, or legal body. I wasn't surprised to hear that. It's hard not to react in those moments, because you wanted to de-escalate and you want to be safe. And then, he kind of engaged me for a little while around, that he knows Jewish people, and that, there's a Jewish person in Border Patrol with him in his unit. And, when we kind of ended our conversation, he said shalom to me, which is, Hebrew for hello, goodbye, and peace. And that was also really curious, like how he knew that word. Hebrew is a word, closely associated both with, of course, the Jewish religion, but it's part of the Zionist National Project. So, was really curious about how the kind of evocation of that word and that language, particularly as a Border Patrol agent. That was kind of what locked me in with this project was, both these experiences visiting the cemetery and the kind of questions they brought up, how towns are investing in protecting these cemeteries, and then, of course, this really intense landscape of militarization and surveillance. What are these kind of sacred Jewish sites doing here? What is the state's investment in protecting them? Who are the different community stakeholders? And what stories can we kind of pull out of these sacred sites?
Something that really stands out to me within your work as well is your mention of the local indigenous communities as well. And I'm wondering what you learned that most stands out about the relationships between the Jewish settlers in the Southwest and what their relationships were like with the indigenous population of the region, considering discussions of displacement and borders and like things like that also show up later in your work as well. And I'm wondering what you learned about the local indigenous communities.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. So, thinking about this topic, okay, like Jewish Indigenous American relationships, I would point any listeners to the work of David Kaufman and Sarah Imhoff, who really did a lot of excellent kind of earlier work about the way that Jewish and Jewish Americans used ideas about indigeneity, or quote unquote the Indian, and frontier space, frontier land, the West in general, as kind of part of a Jewish identity project, figuring out how to be both Jewish and American at the same time. And it's not, there's a long history of like American whiteness using ideas of indigeneity and ideas of Blackness to assert American whiteness. So we're thinking of, the history of minstrelsy and blackface is so much about white Americans establishing themselves as white, and using ideas of Blackness and performing Blackness to do that. And the same thing with these ideas of playing Indian, that we see, all the way back to the Boston Tea Party. Those Boston rioters were dressed up in their ideas of indigenous clothing and garb, kind of as an expression of belonging to this continent, and masculinity is super tied up in that. So I just want to offer, like, that Jewish Americans also participated in this kind of racial masquerade vis-a-vis indigeneity all the way back since the 19th century. And both Sarah Imhoff and David Kaufman's work kind of look at vaudeville and travel memoirs and literature and poetry and photography to kind of think about how, oftentimes Jewish indigenous relationships are part of this imaginary realm of Jews in urban centers on the coast imagining Jewish life on the frontier, and imagining Jewish indigenous relationships and dynamics and friendships. I'll point listeners to an excellent and really complicated vaudeville song called "The Yiddish Cowboy." I believe it's from the early 1900s. It's on YouTube, and it's very much thinking about this Yiddish urban Jewish peddler existing in this Wild West frontier landscape and kind of enacting really terrible racial gendered violence against against a native tribe that he encounters. And that was just very evocative, very emblematic of this kind of imaginary realm of Jewish indigenous relationships. And then, of course, there's a material like relationship, materially grounded relationship. And David Kaufman's work talks a lot about it's called the Indian curio industry. So this, the way that you might go to any small town across the American West, and definitely, really popular in places like New Mexico or Nebraska, Colorado, these kind of small shops that might have the title like Indian curio shop or Indian trading post. Jewish immigrant settlers in the 19th century played this really outstanding or disproportionately large role in the curio industry. So we kind of see the way that Jewish immigrants are these kind of intermediaries between, a persecuted multiple indigenous populations and nations, and the white Eastern United States who are kind of interested in the Southwest or the Wild West or the American West, but will never actually go there. Jewish immigrants played a large role in like commodifying certain objects and oftentimes ritual objects, and bringing them into kind of a capitalist commercial market to be bought and sold. So things like moccasins, headdresses, other objects like that. We see Kaufman's work really talks about how pervasive, how key Jewish immigrants were in kind of popularizing that form of trade. And then, I'll say for my research and my first hand experience, like the Tombstone Jewish Cemetery, that has a plaque, which is partly why I've been so obsessed with it. The plaque at that cemetery says, "To the memory of Jewish pioneers and their Indian friends." And so, of course, I really wanted to know who those Indian friends were. And, again, we see this kind of potentially imagined relationship between Jewish settlers and what would have been maybe the Chiricahua Apache peoples. Those are the people who are indigenous to the land where the Tombstone Cemetery is built. And in terms of material reality, the only one I could find was the actual stakeholders of the preservation of the Tombstone Cemetery itself, which were several Jewish Americans who were snowbirds, meaning they're from the East Coast, go to Arizona during the winter or go there on vacation and find these projects around historical preservation of Jewish sites. And then there's a man named Lawrence C. Huerta. He was the first American Indian to graduate from University of Arizona Law School. He became a judge, and he was a tribal member of the Yaqui Nation. And he developed a relationship with one of these Jewish community stakeholders who really wanted the cemetery preserved. And he played a big role in kind of facilitating conversations with the Tombstone Chamber of Commerce, kind of helping get funding for the restoration of that cemetery, which happened in the 1980s. So the plaque itself is really, less about Jewish pioneers and their Indian friends, but really kind of a working partnership between a few Jewish Americans who were not from that region, nor have really ancestral ties to that region, and this man, Lawrence C. Huerta, who is a member of the Yaqui Nation, who really helped get the project completed. So we kind of see, interesting slippage between both imagined and material relationships between Jewish and indigenous peoples. And then the other thing that comes up to me that has kind of shaped my thinking around the role of the state in all of this, the role of the state in protecting or destroying different communities' sacred sites, is the reality that these Jewish cemeteries that are protected in areas where Jews haven't lived for over 100 years typically. The descendants of those people buried have very little connection or involvement with these preservation projects, and yet they are protected. The Tombstone Cemetery is part of the National Register of Historic Places. And then just thinking about the broader regional context of the destruction of sacred sites that happen for different indigenous tribes, and I'm thinking of the Tohono O'odham nation, which is, they are indigenous to an area that traverses Arizona and Sonora, kind of towards the more west part of Arizona. And that nation is dealing with multiple occupations and destructions of their sacred sites. So if we think about contemporary border wall construction and expansion, it's done tremendous damage to the Organ Pipe National Monument, which is actually, that's a national park. So the border wall expansion that began I think the expansion in that area began in 2019, continued into 2020, 2021. That used a loophole law called the Real ID Act, passed in 2005, I believe, that allows the government to continue a project in the name of national security. The border wall was considered a national security issue and allowed the government to override existing environmental protections in that area, as well as tribal claims to that region, and specifically an area called Monument Hill and Quito Paquito Springs, which are sacred sites to the O'odham Nation and hold the ancestral remains from about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. So tremendous kind of spiritual ancestral histories of this tribe, who have kind of both cultural claims to the area, and then also there's all these U.S. environmental protections protecting that area through the national park system that can just get overrode in the name of national security and military expansion. So for me, doing research in that area and thinking not just where are these Jewish sites like in relationship to other sacred sites in the region, and whose sites are being protected and considered considered as valid religious and sacred sites that are worthy of preservation. And I think that really gets into a larger question of whose grief matters, right? And how do we protect spaces where people can do that grieving as a central part of the human experience.
Another thing that really stands out to me is your interest in how Judaism and Jewish memory function as unstable tools of statecraft in the US, and how that comes to play here. Also in the article and discussions a little bit about Israel, and as well as in the piece through the framework of a concept that you call implication. But you write that you, quote, look at the ways in which maintenance of Jewish heritage in the sites in the American Southwest is a process implicated by the ratio religious requirements of U.S. settler colonialism at the U.S.-Mexico border, and inextricable from the ratio religious objectives under Israeli settler colonialism. And in light of the news in the last couple of months, part of me doesn't even really know where to begin with this topic, but I wanted to give you the chance to kind of say where you are in this moment as a person who looks at these topics and concepts and is looking at connections between here and there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think there's two ways to answer that. I think kind of grounded in, I'll do one grounded kind of in the work, and then the other kind of this this contemporary moment, kind of bring some examples from the contemporary moment, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, I explained around like what this archetype of the Jewish pioneer is, and really it's a masculinity project, it's a racial project. It's thinking about who knows how to make the land the most productive, and that exists, and that's kind of rooted, as we were talking about, in this kind of these 19th century tropes and kind of imagined archetypes of Jews in the American West, and that exists alongside this other trope that is inextricably linked up, I think, with this image of the Jewish pioneer, which is the new Jew, or this term that was used to describe European Jewish settlers to Palestine pre-1948. This trope is also a masculinity and racial project, and thinks deeply about who it can make the land the most productive, who can lay claim to that land, who is kind of the agent and arbiter of modernity and civilization on that land. And these two kind of tropes really feel collapsed to me when I look at these cemetery sites. Another way to say it is I can't analyze this commemorative landscape of the Jewish pioneer without thinking about the Jewish settler in Palestine. Mm-hmm. These projects, at least discursively or rhetorically, have this kind of moment of collapse for me. And then, I think over the last 2 months, we're seeing, going back to this question around grief and mourning, and safety, whose grief and whose safety matters, and kind of gets to take up the most space. And if we look at things like, I work in a college, and if we took a sample of like every college or university statement out there after October 7th, it's a really clear solidarity claim and statement, implicit or implicit, but I think it's pretty explicit about whose fear and whose grief matters, and the kind of the way that Jewish safety and Jewish grief, and of course Israeli grief and Israeli safety, always supersedes the grief and fear and mourning of Muslim American and Palestinian students and faculty, right? So and I think the blatant asymmetry around grief and whose life is worth protecting, we're just seeing that play out on college campuses in this really, really explicit way. And when so much of student organizing, when it's for on behalf of Palestine solidarity and the Palestinian struggle, so much of those student protests, at least that I've seen both on the news and on my own campus, are demands to create grieving spaces and demand that their pain is acknowledged by the university and is acknowledged and is allowed to exist on the space of the college campus. And the kind of the criminalization of that, the suppression of that, the removal of student-led initiatives to create grief spaces, I think is an overwhelming example of this kind of creating a hierarchy around whose grief and ultimately whose humanity matters.
Dr. Maxwell Greenberg, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's been a real thrill.
Thank you, Greg. It was such a pleasure. I appreciate all your interesting questions.